So yeah, thanks to everyone for coming. Just to kind of give you a little kind of intro to what we were talking about there. Obviously, everyone that's in here has taken part in some of the activities that we've done or knows what we're talking about, but we're thinking about this Q&A as also a bit of a legacy of the work that these four have done. So we'll probably be answering and talking. We're not live streaming it, but we're still kind of thinking about a sort of wider audience for it. So you might hear a bit of stuff that you know already, and we're kind of addressing people that are outside of the room, but I hope you'll bear with us on that. So we're going to do a sort of talk for an hour, and it'd be nice to get into a Q&A and kind of like start, well, for you to ask questions, both of the artists and for the artists to ask questions of each other as well. But yeah, don't think there's any sort of housekeeping or anything that we need to know, is there? No, fire alarms. Fire exits there. I've already set the alarm off already, so you don't need to worry about that happening again. So yeah, I'm Andy Abbott. I'm the lead artist on the This Is Nelson programme, and within that we've got this strand called Nelson Reimagined, which is about sort of the forward-thinking part of the research that we might do, and thinking about what the long-term sort of life of this investment that's coming in through the town deal could be. Really key to that is this idea of artist research and kind of bringing in artists that will sort of unearth and uncover interesting aspects of Nelson that we've maybe not thought of before, or kind of things that exist here that could be built on to create a more sustainable future for Nelson that sort of outlives the course of the funding. So in the first year, we've been very lucky to have four artists with us undertaking what we call micro commissions around research and development within this Nelson Reimagined strand. And we sort of put the brief out with an idea that we might sort of suggest some areas or kind of themes that the artists could look at. And from that process, they've kind of taken that as the starting point, done your own thing, and sort of this weekend, obviously, we've brought all that together after the first year. So I'm going to sort of move around and just kind of ask you to introduce yourselves through, what the starting point was, sort of why maybe you applied, and also kind of what you were hoping to find out through that, and then we'll kind of go around and start sort of a more conversational way of doing things. So maybe I can start with Dana, seeing as you're furthest away from me, Dana. What's up? Yeah, if you want to say who you if you want to say,
yeah, sure. So my name is Dana. I'm a socially engaged artist, and I guess what first kind of drew me to apply was the way the call out was actually written, I think, and I think I really aligned with its values, which were really about long-term thinking, and I really appreciated the four strands. They were sort of detailed in the brief, and I was really drawn to working with food. This is an element that sort of appears in my practice quite a lot, but I really loved the way it was framed in the brief, in the sense that it was about locally grown food, it was about local resources, it was about exploiting what is here and kind of unearthing with what is already here, rather than coming up with new ideas. So I think that's, in a nutshell, what drew me to this.
So it's the food aspect that drew you into it, and then what were you sort of within that hoping to find out specifically, or kind of hoping to research?
Yeah, well, I guess another part of my practice is really working around migration and what that means. And I think food and migration always come together, and food is a binder, and is also a really helpful way of talking about cultures, because we live in a climate where it's really difficult for migrants to talk about anything without being politicized. And food, I think, is an equalizer. So again, I kind of started off with this idea that I'm going to work with some of the people who come from migrant backgrounds to talk about maybe the food businesses that they run, if they did. Again, at that point, I didn't know. Or ways in which perhaps they're growing food in their own homes, and how can we bring these things together, and how can they gain more visibility through the acts that they're making.
Excellent, thanks for that. And then we'll come back in a minute to see what happened there. But before we do that, so with Kristina, do you want to explain what sort of made you want to apply, and kind of what you were hoping to find out?
Yeah, so I'm Kristina, and my practice is very much process-based and with embedded practice methodologies in direct collaboration with the communities. And I kind of see my role at times more as in someone that initiates something, and then I kind of involve the communities to guide that. And what intrigued me in the brief, apart from the thematics, I kind of liked how abstract concepts were presented in a metaphorical way through the park, through the cafe, the town. I don't remember all the terms that were used, but I mean that was kind of which really resonated. And there were two aspects which interested me. One was food, which I guess it is a bit of a common thread amongst us all, and a lot of overlap. The idea of local food is something that I am looking at in my kind of general practice, especially in relation to creating alternative forms of economy, basically community economies, so economies built by the community for the community. And on the other hand, there was this aspect of water, which is something that I am looking into currently. I was doing it unconsciously, and I realized in the past few years that I was kind of always looking into water. So I said, okay, I need to make this like a purposeful decision rather. So that's kind of why I looked into the water, canal and river area and kind of, the potential that these spaces
And I guess
have.
sort of coming from Malta, maybe the kind of the water and the sea is also
totally.
sort of part of your...
I mean, I guess every time I'm away from Malta, I kind of realize what I miss, what I love, what I hate. So yeah, I mean, any form, any body, shape of water makes me feel better.
And the rain.
Yeah. Apart from the rain. That's a complete different shape. Yeah.
Great, thank you for that. Michael, what made you want to apply and what were you interested in finding out?
Kind of similar things. I think, like the values behind it and the process that it was presented in was really interesting and kind of drew me in. But I guess over the last few years, my practice has developed in a couple of different ways. Like I do kind of like illustration-based installation works that I've kind of done to develop kind of my own works and kind of thinking about kind of stories that I've created or people I've collaborated with. But also I'm increasingly interested in kind of like reactivating disused spaces and working within them, be it kind of derelict spaces in localities or kind of disused buildings for like galleries. So it felt like an interesting fit, and I was particularly drawn to the kind of looking at the reactivation, the reimagination of these spaces in Nelson. And I'm from the north myself. I was born in Wigan. I currently live in Todmorden, so it felt like there was a lot of resonance with kind of where I'm from and where I'm working as well to bring into this.
Brilliant, thank you. And Sam?
Hi, my name's Sam. My background's really in creating very embedded durational projects. So the projects I've been working on are really about community wealth building and being able to sort of create systems and structures and positions where communities can take over land, can take over buildings, can create their own economies and create circular economies and really change their neighbourhoods in a quite a dramatic way. So what really interested me with this is that is there a way of doing that across town? I mean, that's a big ask, but that's a big challenge, but how would that work, and is there a possibility to even try and instigate or influence how that happens? And I think I had the unique position to sort of be able to sort of look and observe the other artists and what they're sort of initiating and finding out, and then trying to think through with the communities how that could possibly be sort of made to happen in a sort of structural way. How can we support them to do that? Because at the end of the day, artists, we can support that, but the communities have to do it for themselves. They have to have the skills and the capacity and the will to do that, and trying to find out where the drivers are, and where, watching over the weekend as well, where are the real key drivers from the community, and what are the real strengths of the town, and what can we up to actually start to move that forward.
Yeah, and I guess when you kind of applied, I suppose, coming with that sort of experience of a project like home baked, which gets referenced so much as a really good example of that. I mean, I should say for all four of you, really, we were just sort of delighted that with the kind of the process of doing the selection was obviously really tough, but we were sort of like just thinking, well, we've got four really kind of complementary, exciting artists with a lot of like experience, but yeah, sort of really also what you're saying about the scaling up actually, and kind of well, Nelson is almost at that stage or like that size where you could imagine it offering this potential that maybe doesn't happen elsewhere. So it's really nice to hear that.
It's been a real joy to sort of see how the other artists have sort of really sort of embedded and started to unpick all the sort of possibilities. But the thing is that how do they move forward?
Exactly, yeah.
You know, how that can the community be supported to move that forward, to make it sustainable for the town.
Absolutely. So yeah, maybe we'll come to that sort of
sorry,
shortly.
yeah,
But but it'd be nice before we talk about actually. Well, seeing as this maybe coming this way and going back again might be a good way of doing it, Sam. But yeah. So do you want to talk through a little bit about the process and kind of like what you've been up to and what you've learned? I know you're kind of also kind of ongoing with yours.
I'm sort of rolling over. I mean, my process has been a little bit mixed of sort of observational, sort of really just meeting people, walking around, trying to sort of just let things embed and trying to understand, because it's a really quite complex scenario. It's really on you know, I think for any artist to come in and try and unpick and you know, sort of make sense of that, I think is quite complex, and these guys have done an amazing job. And then also sort of meeting people, sort of, because you know, Nelson's got a fantastic history of creating you know, alternative economies and taking over land, you know, Clarion House and you know, the ILP, it's there already, so cannot be built on. But also, you know, the town has such a complex and wonderful, you know, difference in cultures, and they've got, you know, everybody's got their own economies. How do you start to bring that together to make a sort of a plan for the town?
Absolutely,
you know?
And you've kind of started or begun that sort of process with this kind of mapping exercise.
Yeah, I mean, that was really about thinking about the assets, and assets is a broad term. You know, firstly, what are the physical assets? What's the buildings? What's the sort of the businesses? What's already here? But then also, you know, assets are, you know, our communities, our, you know, individuals, our skills, our time, you know, and these are all assets, and how to sort of think about that, to begin to sort of think about, okay, we have this here in Nelson, but also it was a conversation about, okay, but how to move that forward, and it was really about introducing other projects that I've been involved in or researched or I know of, you know, locally, nationally, and sort of across the world, you know, that really have made that happen. So trying to introduce and sort of just, you know, spark that seed that this can be a possibility. And so over the next month we're starting to look at how to sort of support the community with the tools and the sort of capacity to be able to move forward. So and hopefully the threads that come from, you know, the artists here, we can try and support that, but I think these guys will have their own opinion on that as well.
So yeah, well maybe that's a good invitation. Yeah, well, yeah, how's it gone? What's the kind of, so there was the idea of kind of, yeah, you're interested in underused spaces, and the kind of like, you've had experience there, and kind of what's the process been like, and what have you learned from it?
So I've really enjoyed it. I think that's the first thing to say. I found like people throughout the town are kind of generally really up for a chat, you know, and kind of one of the way I approached it and the thing that I proposed doing was to create an illustrated map of Nelson Town Centre as a kind of, as a way of like a tangible output that I could kind of centre the research upon, you know. I began it in a kind of similar way to kind of Sam, in kind of like a couple of observational visits, talking with people, meeting people who are already doing different things that were kind of linked in and connected to the project already. And then I organised a couple of kind of open access, open to all mapping workshops at Nelson Library that I kind of invited people to, but the intention with those was really to kind of encounter people by chance in those spaces and try to have conversations through doing those activities with people who might not be aware of the projects and or the town deal itself. and have a conversation. So the prompts I kind of asked people were kind of to think about favourite places as a way into talking about underused spaces and kind of adding those to the map, and to thinking about just, you know, what would you like to change about your town centre, again as a way into thinking about how, and having more in-depth conversations about kind of use of space. And then I also like working in this space here at Building Bridges. I've kind of done a few sessions as well, developed through kind of conversations with kind of staff here at Building Bridges who kind of wanted to make more connections with residents who live locally to this space. I'm thinking about the courtyard space that's outside here as a kind of a micro kind of example of an underused space that's neglected and kind of misused at points as well, and thinking about how we could use that space as a talking point for the town more generally. So then kind of ran the mapping sessions outside here in the courtyard on the streets to have conversations with people, and kind of also thinking about kind of like values as well. So kind of wanted to approach it through kind of doing a few creative activities that were free, that were kind of like random acts of kindness as a kind of way in that weren't necessarily related to the mapping activity, but would allow me to then talk to people about what they were doing that day. You know, to kind of not directly go straight into the research and the prompts I wanted to know, but to find about where people were going, how they were using the town, and kind of through there have conversations which I could then reflect upon and kind of build into that process. Nice.
And well, I suppose we should also mention the walk yesterday and the things that happened at this.
So I guess, and then the other thing I wanted to do beyond that was kind of to kind of create something that pulled that together at the end, that kind of like articulated that and brought some of those kind of findings, thinkings, and people who'd been involved in things together. And I feel like, yeah, so yesterday I kind of did an artist walk and talk around the town, and some of the kind of, you know, I talked about it a lot yesterday, but like some of the key things that people have mentioned over time, we looked at some of those spaces that people have talked about and went to visit them, but we also kind of like talked more generally about some of those ideas that are very simple things that kind of I've been listening to and hearing from people around kind of like things to do in the evening or on weekends, spaces to meet in, you know, kind of more food places that have better seating, playful, creative interventions. So I tried to make sure yesterday's activity was kind of driven by what I'd heard, you know, and kind of programmed some surprise performances along the way. And kind of like, so yesterday there was a local poet called AJ who kind of performed in a few of those spaces, a kind of singer called Jennifer Reed who's from Todmorden but also runs the Dementia Choir here in Nelson, kind of like linked into the local community who performed. And then another friend who kind of makes kind of sound installation works, and in one of the disused archways in Nelson he kind of set up this a surprise experience for anyone who's on the walk. But also he said he arrived at 2 yesterday and the walk only began at 4. We only got to Brighton at 5, so he had 3 hours waiting under that arch with the sound installation set up. But he said it was great because he got lots of like. I went for a drink with him last night to kind of chat about it, and kind of like he really enjoyed it, and he got to encounter and talk to lots of different people who came in and kind of like were like from being like what is, you know, but like it was set up in a way where it was like it was confusing and kind of brilliant in that space. And I feel like in the talk yesterday I'd done a lot of talking along the way, and I had plans to talk about that space and things that people had told me, but when we got there, the experience articulated like to everyone, like I feel anyway, kind of like without having to explain what we're trying to do there, and it ended up being a kind of a randomly led parade through the town centre with people wearing strap-on speakers walking across to the train station playing out beautiful music, and like it was great.
Yeah, it was a lovely moment.
And it felt like a really nice,
I'm sure somebody else does.
No, it was good.
Fantastic, yeah, cheers. Okay, we'll come back to kind of like maybe sort of think about what that was like for everyone that was part of it as well. But Kristina, do you want to talk a bit about your process and kind of what you've learned through the because you spent quite a bit of time here for someone who's had to commute quite far.
Well, yeah, I mean my research had to be a bit kind of planned a bit in advance because of the flights. So it was kind of split into 2 phases before this final weekend. So in January we issued an open call for locals to take me on a walk and talk, walking encounter around Nelson, and the invitation was to show me their favorite or the places that they visit in terms of green and blue spaces, in relation to the canal, to the river, but also in the town center. So there was a mix of places in the town center, but mainly it was concentrated on the margins where the water canal flows through. And the objective of that phase was more of a familiarization process for me. So I want to acknowledge that I'm kind of an outsider. I have no expert, or I have no expertise in the context. So it was important for me to familiarize myself with the landscape and the communities alike, like both of them are important on the same level. And during those conversations, we delved into notions such as memory, daily experience, but also whether these spaces are being used on a day-to-day level, like as resources, and what's our relationship with these places. And that phase ended with a group mapping session at Nelson Library, where each person who was on the talk kind of be grouped up together. So from an individual perspective, it became much more of a collective group experience. And the objective of that was to kind of pave the way forward for the next phase of the research. And what emerged from that, I think, the way how the town centre and the water canal, green spaces on the margins are considered as separate spaces. They're not they don't intersect, and they were described as places with a different purpose. So why should we merge them? Because that was my question. How can we exchange more between the resources that we have in those spaces, Canal, Victoria Park, Lomisher Park, etc. But how can we feed back into town? And kind of that question kept on, kind of coming up and popping up. And I felt, well, okay, let's just try it then. Perhaps people, maybe not everyone is kind of seeing that need, others are maybe already making use of that. So then in March, when I came back for the second phase, I decided to collaborate with a local foraging expert who was also Pete Campo, who was also mentioned quite a few times during my walk and talk sessions in January. And my belief is to not impose, but or bring something new, but kind of see what's already happening and help scale it up. And with that kind of philosophy, I invited Pete to collaborate, and we organized this foraging walk, and then we processed it through a hands-on session, crafts-wise, but also edible. So we tasted the nettle cake prepared by another local, prepared by tea. So it was a bit of a mix of edible, non-edible resources and potential, but also kind of even like what's the potential for our well-being on a spiritual level, on a scientific level. So the discussion was quite multi-layered, I would say.
Nice. Yeah. And then this weekend you've kind of managed to kind of pass that walk on through like a zine.
Yeah, so the objective of the zine is to kind of share what there is with others, and more than anything, rather than to kind of do it for them, to facilitate providing the tools so that people can kind of learn and explore in their own time. So it's kind of equip people with skills and allow them to explore, to experiment, to fail and retry kind of. So that's kind of the vision of it, I would say. Yeah.
Fantastic, thanks Kristina. And Dana, what's the process? I mean, I'm still digesting your process, but maybe you can talk a bit about where it thanks.
I'll start with what led us to this feast. So I guess there was just something about, again, I started off with thinking I'm going to speak to a lot of people who come from migrant communities and ask them about food. And that didn't really materialize. So I've spoken to some some. But so I've spoken to the Romanian people who run the shop, which is literally next door, like across the street. And they're brilliant. There's this woman called Angelica who opened it, I think, maybe 6 months ago. And she talked to me about the hardship of opening, an independent shop in Nelson and how financially difficult it is to run it. Her son runs the nights when she needs to go to university. They have this barter between them. It's obviously just like family economics. So I think that was really important. And I was really trying to get them on board for them to come and showcase what they do, but obviously they're incredibly busy. They run a shop, and she goes to uni, and he goes to uni as well. So I guess for me, there was just something about a really tangible reality of like, this is what reality is like. How do you bring people in, and how long do you have to be in a space for people to really be able to even just come from across the road, right? Like, do you go to people, or do they come to you? So that was like the incipient stage. And then Shabazz introduced me to the amazing women who work at Marhaba Cafe every Monday and Tuesday, and so I met them here, and I was really interested in what food politics meant to them, because obviously these are people who have migrated from another continent, who come here and who carry a lot of like incredibly dense political subjects around food. And so what kind of surfaced is that most of them would have run food businesses at home. Most of them wanted to sort of express themselves, like through food, like especially those who don't yet speak English as well as they would like to. And again, it was sort of like this amazing tool that they use. And in the first session that we had, they would show me photos of the food they've cooked last week, and we just found a common language. We found a way to communicate beyond words, and I think that's why food was such an important element there. And then we ran a workshop with them, I think the second time when I returned, which was really about food politics, and it was all about what is it that they're missing, what is it that exists in Nelson that they have discovered and that they'd like to sort of work on, if that makes sense. And that's when we found out that one of them is really, really, really trying to open up her own food business. And so her daughter said, my dream is to actually open a cafe for my mom. And I don't know how to do it. How do we do this? So again, I think there was just something of, these are the tangible things that we need to work on, like bringing people from across the road, but also like ensuring that the knowledge that some other people in town might have about running their own businesses is shared with people who have just arrived, who also provide who cook incredible dishes every Monday and Tuesday at the cafe, and they give them to people, right? So again, like, what is this barter? Like, how can we use this community economy that Sam was talking about to empower people to kind of to become stronger, I guess, to have a stronger voice. And I think something that was incredibly important that happened in the last few months is that the McDonald's opened. And what does this McDonald's bring? Like, what is the added value to the town, right? And I think everyone I've spoken to feels quite unsettled by the fact that it's open. But how do we oppose that, right? How does a community become, can kind of use its voice to oppose it? Like, what do you put against it, like, in front of a huge corporation? Can you? So these were some of the questions. And then I went to St. Paul's C of E school and worked with students there. They were incredible, the pupils who, we just walked in and I asked them what their favorite food was. And no one said pizza or pasta, which I sort of assumed, like it was a really bad assumption of me. But one of them said, you know what, like the apples from the trees taste so much better than the apples from Morrison's. And so we talked about it a bit, and then I returned a month later, and so we talked about food that grows seasonally. We went through every single month, what grows there. We learned together, and then they made menus for the school, the foods that they would like to eat in the canteen, and things such as kale ice cream came up, and just really, really interesting kind of notions of food, with them being incredibly, I think, stimulated and curious about it. You did not have the answer of like, we're not going to have vegetables, like it wasn't that at all. And of course what we found out was that just outside the classroom there's a polytunnel that lies empty. There's nothing in it. And we had previously with Kristina, we'd met the Good Life Project that runs an allotment, and they grow a lot of incredible organic food. So what we were hoping is to actually connect the Good Life Project with the school to teach the children how to grow the food, and then the food would be served in the canteen. So those are hopefully the next steps that should be happening, again, like through the bartering of the organizations who can kind of fill in the gaps, right, and ensure that there is enough capacity both from the school and from the Good Life Project. I'm trying to think, and then of course there were a lot of individual conversations that I've had with people, and I think the first community assembly was brilliant for that, because I ask people what is it that they would like to do with food, and I've heard everything from I would like to have more restaurants to I would like to run my own things, I would like to be able to grow, I would love to go and forage. And I think from there, then I sort of got to this point of everyone knows what they would like to do. Like, of course they do, because we all eat, right? Why would we think otherwise? Everybody eats. So then how do we problem solve together, and how do we ensure that every single I guess perception is actually taken into account? So that's when I kind of launched this challenge, which was, what can you do with £20 that is sustainable, and what does sustainability mean to you within the Nelson landscape? And so I shared my budget with everyone who wanted to do it, and they would source ingredients that are sustainable to them. Then they would turn them into a dish and bring the dish to this communal feast. I'll backtrack a bit to say that Jan, for example, who's here, like, took me on this amazing journey. I went to Jan's garden I think 2-3 months ago, and you showed me everything that you grow. And I think Jan self-described herself as an upcyclist, an extreme upcyclist,
yeah,
right?
Definitely upcyclist.
And again there was just something of this energy of, here is someone who builds soil, who uses compost, who uses the local economy in a really smart way. And how can we ensure that this is replicated, that it's not just one person, or one household? Like, how do we turn this into a movement? Speaking of community economies. And so then what happened earlier? Obviously, in the meantime, like, I've spoken to people, I've invited them to participate in the challenge. People started thinking about it. People sent recipes, and of course, sustainability means so many different things to different people. And so today, when they brought the dishes together, we heard everything from, sustainability means passing down recipes. Andrew brought the recipe from his mother, and it's all about traditions, and it's ensuring that when change happens, traditions don't get lost. Someone talked about the conditions of the workers and the things that we don't see that are hidden behind labels. And what happens and I guess that's exactly what happens when you get corporations. They're not liable, whereas if you're an independent company, you kind of have to make everything transparent. I'm just trying to think what else was shared today, but it was just so rich and incredible, I think. But again, people brought literally old notebooks of their grandparents with recipes, which are so important. The women from the cafe cooked this incredible spread, not with £20, because of course they wanted to share so much more, right? And I think so much of it is like, we want to give in, we're here and we really want to make you feel as welcome as we feel. And again, I think that's a really important term to constantly go back on. But I think, it was brilliant to see everyone come together and talk about it. And I guess for me now is, and what do we do with this now? How do we take all this knowledge, and what are the next steps to ensure that the people who want to open businesses are empowered with the knowledge, those who want to grow food, those who want to build soil, how do we actually build, physically, what do we do?
Okay. I mean, you kind of, I would, before we get into, maybe, because, you've led into that really nicely, but, I mean, the thing that kind of has joined the four of you and the approach has been spot on, I think, for Nelson, is that, you've all taken this sort of deep listening approach, really. You've come here kind of being willing to listen and hear, and although you've come with different perspectives and different experiences of other places that you might sort of think, that could work, or a theory, really, I think your openness to kind of finding out and listening was what really drove the project. So you kind of, you've heard lots of, or been asked lots of questions and kind of gathered lots of questions, and I guess, like Diana's just doing now, maybe it's now, we're at this stage of the end of the first year of research where what are the questions that you would like to leave for us, or for for the next stage, or for the next kind of, for future researchers, because I should say that the kind of methodology that we're trying to work with around, certainly within the Nelson Reimagined strand, is that artistic R&D isn't just you do research and then you have some outcomes and that's it. It's kind of a cycle of kind of, you find questions, those questions become more refined, they kind of, you discover more, and then that you try that out, you test it out, and then you sort of hopefully reveal more questions and get to a point where, you've created that foundation to build the new Nelson on, or whatever it will be. But so Diana's kind of question that you were really sort of leaving us with us there is to do around, what are the next steps, but how do you sort of build on? I mean, do you want to talk a little bit more about that, just so we can sort of go back?
Yeah, I can try, I suppose. Well, I think for me, it's also how do you turn this research into practice? And I think and also I think it's so important to say this, like we are artists, right? We are artists, and what we do is we ask questions, you know, like we're not architects, and we're not town planners, and we're not structural engineers, so it's very difficult for us to say, okay, from now on, this is what you do. And also, like, we're not prescribers, and I think that's exactly what you mean. Like, we're here to listen, and all we're doing is we're using our own skills and our own experience to say, well, maybe, perhaps, like, you can do it this way, but obviously, this is your project, this is your town, like, what do you think should happen? And I think for me is, how do we actually ensure that this deep listening process goes further, like, goes out, and the people who really own the money use this as well, right? Like, how do we ensure that this really spills out as a movement, that the people who come and who want to do this, like, put a lot of pressure on others as well.
So a sort of question around, who's hearing these conversations as well, and how do we kind of open up the audience for that? So that's a good question to have. I mean, I think we can also, I mean, we're amongst friends, we can also sort of be sort of like, you know, I think I'd like to give you license actually to be a bit more sort of hypothetical and not feel too guilty, but I could imagine this happening, or I could imagine that. And there were so many ideas, like you're saying, that were just coming from your research and the feast today about kind of, the Mahabra Cafe opening up a new food business, or kind of you could see those kind of that list of potential things that could come out, which might be nice for us to gather at some point.
And people organizing, I think, and that's what's really, really important, that it takes a large number of people to be able to shift things together. And I think today, when we were looking at 30 people who all had, in a sense, different ideas of what that meant to them, but actually they were all connected. They were all connected, and they all worked really well with each other. So I think for me, it's how do we ensure that these spaces, like, are possible, and people can come together to make these things happen.
Nice, thank you. So just to kind of break up the rhythm, I'm going to go to you, Michael. And we'll go. I was just thinking about it. But yeah, so what are the questions or the prompts you think you would leave for a future bit of research?
I think there's two things for me. There's kind of like echoing what Dana's talked about there. I think it's I think great work is being done within Nelson by kind of organisations who are represented here, people who kind of volunteer or are involved in stuff here, doing those, and connections that have been kind of developed further and brought in through conversations we've been having as part of this project. But I guess in terms of like my research and thinking about the wider town deal, I'm really interested in how this strand interacts and relates to the other strands, and how it kind of operates where those other strands are listening and kind of involved in a process, thinking about the deep listening element. I think the other element I'm interested in is I've been, working in this space with building bridges and thinking like on a much more micro level, like working directly and trying to chat to kind of business owners and residents who live around here. And I've kind of done a few sessions where I've kind of began a process of kind of like trying to build relationships with people in this space who necessarily weren't linking in and knew about building bridges, even though building bridges tried to kind of like make connections all the time with those residents. And kind of, so it's how we're not just in that example, but in all of the projects, how are those relationships kind of fostered and developed further, and those to kind of build that kind of critical mass where there is the attempt for that shift, or there is the momentum for that to happen.
That's great. Yeah. What about for you, Kristina? Have you got a question or a prompt you're going to leave with us after the research?
I think I would say it's twofold. Firstly, maybe a bit more specific to my strand. I felt the need also coming from the people who are questioning. I feel that there's the urge and the want for more walking in order to gain more knowledge about our own space, the space we inhabit. So it was interesting for me to realize that not everyone kind of knows that a canal passes through Nelson. So I think that says a lot. So especially after the foraging walk in March, I did feel the need that people wanted more of walking. There was this need to get to know more. And I would kind of still try to revisit in different ways and means of this exchange between the town centre and the green and blue spaces on the margins. So that's kind of more specific to my strand. And in order kind of to build upon that, I will go to the second point. And what feels urgent for me now is to dig deeper on a general level by kind of seeing what overlaps, what crosses over between the different work of us four, because I can sense that there are overlaps and points which feed into each other, and I think it would be a pity if we miss that point. So that feels like an urgent next step.
Okay, yeah, that's a very good point, and I guess, you know, again, just before I go to you, Sam, but I suppose the idea with this is that we're beginning that sort of debrief process, aren't we, and that actually, to be able to kind of, look at the crossovers and things and say, well, that's probably the next stage, isn't it? The next sort of phase of research is a really good way of thinking about that, so thanks for bringing it up. But yeah, Sam, you're kind of, I mean, again, you're in a slightly different position where you've got a couple more sessions to follow up on, but I mean, what do you think the kind of, the questions that you've got at the moment that you're leaving with us are, or that you'll be using in those sessions?
I think building on a little bit of the connections and to create that critical mass, because I think that really needs to be sort of strengthened and digging deeper to try and keep that momentum going and how that can sort of happen, because you could the infrastructures are there to support that, but if that movement doesn't, is not there, it's not to support. So I think, really the connections that have happened, and being involved in these artists sort of weekend as well, seeing how these crossovers are happening, and also the sort of the meal today really showed that the people really do want to come together. They do. They want that conversation. So I think there's how do we create more moments like that to make those connections, to make that consolidation, but then start to shape and give form for the dialogue that needs to happen more, for that to move forward, and then start to sort of point it in the direction it needs to go into. And I think also the spaces as well, I think is really interesting, the arch and the different things like that. I think how there's real moments and the walks as well, the interactions with people, because you're in a public space. That activation of the public space, I think, started to bring public together. So I think really that's a real need for investigation, those public spaces where, this activity that draws people together, that connects people as well. And with that, for me, it's how do you support that, but also the individual ideas or people or projects that are coming out of this as well. So it's sort of a macro and a micro, and sort of the larger scale, but also supporting those individual people or ideas or projects to make that then move forward. Because the town is made up of individuals, so supporting them builds capacity, but then how can we all connect these things together as well?
Okay. And I actually think, it's a really good point you brought up there, but you've all, as much as it's research and kind of future thinking, you've all done quite concrete, specific, sort of had these conversations, met individuals, sort of showing us that there are things that work, you've applied it through the kind of, through the work that you've done, and I think we're all very grateful for that, and we'll kind of continue to, I'd love to do this weekend again next weekend. That's what it's felt like. It's like, it'd be good to have more people doing it. But before I put that on, Corinne Callum to organise it. I just think we just had too much time to organise it this time. So. We'll open it up for a discussion with everyone that's here, maybe, in case there's sort of questions. We've got sort of just over 15 minutes, but
I've got one more.
Oh, go on.
Sorry. I think also it's been brought up here. How do we create a space for dialogue with that becomes democratic all the time? And how do you facilitate those conversations and create? And that might be in some ways creating a body that leverages that as well. So there's, there's how, I think that's a question that I'd be sort of curious to, myself or somebody else to take on board, I think.
Great, that's a really good point. And I think you also, just going to the...
Remember that's but I forgot about that.
But again, you sort of identified the seeds of that in kind of things that are happening through the community assemblies or the talkie-okie, and there's like, there's a lot already, as you say, in Nelson.
Can I just say there is a real strong dialogical, and that's at our term, sorry, there's a real strong conversational discourse, democratic discourse happening already. And I think there's an opportunity to take that, and whatever model people want to take it, to start to shape that into something that can start to influence the decisions that are getting made.
I do agree with that totally.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like a sort of, something we should definitely be taking forward. Again, it's about sort of, like you say, leverage and kind of how do you scale up and how do you get sort of, the people in power to kind of also hear these, important sort of conversations about the place. So, does anyone have any sort of questions from the floor, or whilst you formulate them? I mean, you've begun it, but I just think, of course, you four are here. You've all been chatting together, but do you have any questions for each other, or kind of any? Just even comments. It doesn't have to be questions. It's kind of just sort of things that have resonated from this conversation as well.
I think the thing I was just thinking. I think just to kind of like, I feel like the community assemblies that I kind of participate in do feel like a real, like I think the way they've been facilitated and developed, linked into this, I feel like they are like a real opportunity in terms of like that initial mechanism for kind of bringing people in and maybe bringing in some of the kind of reflections or ideas that have come or that cross across different kind of outputs of our research into those, like perhaps like more of a shared meal element or kind of like that are a bit more interactive. I feel like those are ways that you can draw maybe new people to them. There's already like a strong body of people there, and I feel like the last ones that I've been to, there's been different people at those that have come for different reasons. I feel like they are a real strength to this project and kind of really reflective of kind of like how across Nelson there's lots of people who want to be involved in things and are interested in kind of inputting in those as well.
Nice. Go on, Anna.
Hi. Can I ask perhaps a more general question about the practice to do with deep listening? And I'm interested in hearing what any of you might like to say about the process of channeling everything that is going in when you're in the listening position, when it comes to handing over in a debrief kind of scenario to an organisation or a collective of organisations in this case, that process of channeling and consolidating all that you've heard, thinking about what you were saying, Dana, about ensuring that all perspectives are kind of, I can't remember what you said, kind of accounted for, I think you said. I'm just interested in that kind of idea of you as practitioners with your own ways of, kind of seeing and building, and what the responsibility or something like that is for people in this kind of position when it comes to filtering and channeling. Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah, so kind of, not to paraphrase, but what's the kind of like what's the process of filtering all these things that you've heard? Because that's kind of I think we talked about actually when we were doing the interviews. It's like there's obviously the kind of things that we've asked you to find out, then there's all the stuff that you're going to hear that we didn't ask you to find out. It's almost that stuff that's more important than what we kind of know. So how's that filtering worked or not worked? How have you captured the kind of the ephemeral nature of the practice?
I like the way how you use the word responsibility. I do feel responsible that people are kind of sharing the thoughts and entrusting me with their opinions, with their experience, and I do feel that responsibility, and I try to remain as open as much as possible and kind of remain neutral. I think it comes a bit more easy when you have a more objective point of view, like not knowing the context so much for me, coming from outside. I think it would be a bit of a different perspective when I work in Malta, for example, because obviously I have my own biases, which I cannot, you know, move away from overnight to a certain point. And yeah, there were points which came up in my conversations which I didn't plan to research about, to ask, or which didn't form part of my brief. But the fact that I kind of got to hear about them from so many different people, and they all brought it up in a very organic, natural way, I kind of, I need to acknowledge that, and I cannot ignore it. So I feel responsible to pass that knowledge on to the organization. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the kind of what lands with you when you're listening, and what are the reasons why something lands more than another that makes you kind of start to consolidate different things in a particular direction. Or yeah, thank you.
I think there's something like I think all the things that people have done, and I feel it's when you're getting into, as well as deep listening, it's kind of it's prompts that have allowed you to get into deeper conversations with people, or then kind of it's more like a noticing of different resonances of themes that have come up from different people across the town. I feel like in what I've been doing and what I've been hearing from people, there's lots of themes that aren't necessarily things that I kind of directly been thinking about or kind of thought I would research, that are more general in relation to kind of like the wider use of the town centre, or the kind of the wider town deal, and kind of like just like regular pet hates that people have mentioned, or kind of like regular ideas, but also without talking about those things, you can't really talk about the kind of the smaller details or the smaller things, you know, if that makes sense. Like, and in my talk yesterday, I kind of went over some of those themes a little bit, but like I think like the parking in the town is a key example of that. Pretty much everyone I've talked to about in different, like, parking has been mentioned constantly. It's not something I was like anticipating researching or thinking about, but it is a barrier, you know, and it's kind of like it's acknowledging that and using that as you know, and this kind of the responsibility is the thing here, to kind of explore that further, and to kind of, and also to interrogate that further in kind of how you reflect upon it, and also how you then kind of like continue those conversations with people about it, because that then has allowed me to kind of have other conversations with people about kind of other barriers or other things which, without, you know, because if you ask someone like, what's your favourite underused space, what does that mean, you know? Do you know? But if you ask someone like, what are you doing today, or like, and then you mention something that annoys them, you can like, that's a way into kind of talking about more general things, and that's as part of my process. It's something I find really interesting, and something that always brings surprises with it. And even just yesterday, like a thing I haven't mentioned in this, but like one of the things kind of I did here with Shabazz, but we've created a small palette garden upstairs for the residents up there. And I went up to decorate, anecdotally here, I went up to kind of decorate it yesterday and kind of label it. But in that moment of doing that, I encountered 4 different people who I'd never spoken with, who actually came and spoke to me about it, and about kind of what they'd been like. Someone had like replanted something that had been pulled out. So, you know, I mean, and someone who wasn't around in the week and we'd never met before at that time was really interested in, and it's kind of like, so I passed on their name and house number to Shabazz as a kind of like, because they were like, they're well up for a chat, and I feel like there's that kind of like responsibility of kind of like sharing those anecdotal conversational elements as well, but I don't know the exact mechanism for doing all of them, you know.
I think also that not being didactic, because if you're I've done academic research and I have questions, same questions, can answer all those questions, everyone's going to answer the same questions, and then you extrapolate the information, and that limits the conversation, and it also limits the humanity and the generosity between two people having a conversation, and it begins to open up. If you're going in with a monitoring perception or way of being, it's going to shut down any conversation, any democracy between two human beings opening up to each other. And I think that deep listening is between two people as well. They'll be listening to you and picking up what you're saying. And people, you know, I'll say, you know, we've all said this, everybody here in Nelson, they are the people who have the skills. They are the people who have the knowledge. So we're listening to that, but also people will pick up if you are trying to sort of just pull information out of them. So I think, you know, you have to go on at a very human level and just listen and have those conversations and share. Sometimes that sharing is quite open as well. You have to share yourself to get something back. And then it's not about extrapolating that information, it's just that as you have those number of conversations, these themes start to come out. You start to pull out the repeated themes. Now they're all coming from different ways and different routes in, but you'll start to pull out the heart of what is going on, even if it's really complex. Now, you might only get the top of it because you're not here, you know, but you know, sometimes you can start to get down deeper into those layers, you know, and I think you can only do that by not going in with a very systematic monitoring, let's get this information out, because if you do that, yeah, you're not going to get very far, I don't think, at all.
Interesting. I mean, I kind of think there's, I mean, yeah, sorry, because I'm going to also take a way to answer that as well, because of course I'm one of the artists involved in the thing. But to kind of, but I mean, that question going on to, I suppose, yeah, the role between structure and kind of like free form, kind of improvisatory kind of like ways of finding out about stuff. I think it's interesting at a programming level where it's kind of, okay, there are some defined things in a program like this. It's 3.5 years, well, 5 years now, 3.5 years long. There's this much money, there are these things to sort of do, and you're always sort of playing within a kind of structure that sort of exists, but sort of then trying to push at the sort of edges of that to kind of find the humanity or the spontaneous bits, which I think is kind of just for the practice more generally, whether it's the organisation or whether it's doing the research or whether it's doing the the work itself, is the kind of is this sort of dynamic between structure and structurelessness and humanity, and kind of something that is a driver for those things, which I think is very interesting in the way it plays out in a place like East Lancashire, because you've got this kind of legacy of kind of embedded sort of slow practices. There's definitely, I don't know if you, maybe I'll put it to you, but I mean, do you feel like there's something, anything like unique or different about, I mean, we've talked about things like the actual history, but just as a general feel or kind of emotive response or effective response to Nelson, do you feel there's anything sort of there?
Can I just
different?
respond to the first thing first? I think there's an element, and you used to do that, is you've chosen artists with a particular perception. Therefore, when we're listening, that's what we'll be drawing out. And it's a massive trust in the artist to sort of do that in a sort of, you know, research methodology, their own, and then they'll still extrapolate that information, you know, whichever way. And there is a form to it, it's just not in a sort of, structured academic, anyway, that way. Secondly, what's unique to yeah, it's really interesting coming, you can hear my accent, so anyone who's like full on accent, there you go. There's a real, I come from a town, I would say, a city that's a quite generous city in sort of disposition, and I found that is here. Incredible generosity, incredible openness, and there's a real sort of capacity for sort of hosting you as well and looking after you. Everybody you meet wants to look after you. Every single individual, is wanted to look after us, not just in situ, everyone we've met. And I think that is really heartening, because obviously that is there in the town. And how do you connect all that to each other, the individuals to each other, because there's a generosity, it's hard to be sort of bring that together as a whole. And I think there's something really quite beautiful about it.
So the hospitality and the generosity is the kind of the effective connection that you've found. Nice. Has that been the same for the rest of you, or is there any other?
Yeah, no, I'd echo that completely. Like, I think, I was brought up kind of along the East Lancs Road, kind of in between St Helens and Wigan, I feel like like a generosity and openness to kind of have conversations, and kind of a general interest in, you know, even just like, even yesterday, some of the kind of the funny conversations that were had through us being in the town centre doing something and people kind of interacting with us, I think in a curious or playful or kind of like maybe slightly unruly way, but like, you know, I feel like that's all part of it, you know, and that's all part of the kind of culture of kind of this part of the world, and also like the part of the world where I grew up. And it's something that kind of sits with me and kind of through kind of resonates with me. So that's why I've enjoyed working in this space. You know, I don't know if it's been different, like coming from a different country and a different culture in.
I mean, I don't know.
They're not that generous. They're not as hospitable as the Maltese.
No.
So dry.
No, what I mean is, I'm not sure like what's the difference or not, or you know, I mean, yeah, I felt the generosity of the people, but I can't say that I didn't find it elsewhere.
Yeah.
So
maybe it's kind of, I guess it's kind of like.
So I can't find that point with, you know. That's why I don't know.
Yeah, no, I get that.
I mean, I think it's a bit of a cliche to say that coming from a different place or coming. I mean, yeah, there are certain things which identify certain groups of people, but I avoid stereotypes. So
I just think there's something about scale as well, because after your first visit, you bump into people on the street and you talk, and that's how you build a rapport, right? So I think there's like the combination of like people being really generous and working at small scale, which is really, really important, because that's how you build on the work. And I think, you know, after like 4 visits now, like when I walk down the street, I kind of know so many people, and it's so important, because I think if you were in a large city doing this would not be the case, and so your work would be so much harder. But I think that's also the things that you kind of really need to capitalize on, because you've already built the trust, right? Like even between the 5 of us, like all the people that we've met who obviously also know each other, who also have these conversations about us, right, when we're not here. And I think it's so important to kind of to shift those into something else.
And also the fact that people you have, for example, conversed with were the people I met, or you know, like these crossovers. And speaking of the small scale, going back to your question, it kind of feels very home for me, coming from what at a small scale.
Yeah.
So the fact that, you know, going out on the streets, you're working in a town, and you could end up meeting.
And I think it's because the town centre and where people live is so connected in this space in terms of how people walk. So I feel like when mapping out the town centre space, like when people kind of gave me and placed favourite places, they weren't all. A lot of them weren't in the town centre, but I think there is, because Nelson is, because of the scale, there's a blurring of what that is and how people interact with it as well. Whilst kind of within our research, it was kind of it was defined where we were kind of operating in a way or kind of thinking about, but actually people who live here, I think because of how easy it is to walk across spaces and walk into spaces, there is a real blurring, and that's really interesting.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting is the density of housing, like close to the town centre.
Yeah.
I think that, you know, you have that to a degree in the places, but that was something that became very apparent, very sort of straight away. You know, you're just walking, you know, you're in the streets and you're in houses and you're in communities and that. And that, how do you sort of capitalise on that? You know, and in some ways, you know, I think thinking about it less of the town and more of the streets and the communities, right, connected to each part of it. Sometimes trying to connect the whole thing, you know, may not work. It might be that, you know, this bit needs certain things, that, you know, that part, you know, you know. So it's sort of sometimes by homogenising it might not be, you know, it may work, but you know, you could look at it in a very different sort of way as well. I think what's interesting is there's a lot of sort of parts of town that, you know, the sort of, you can't drive on, so you've got really, really good public spaces that can be really sort of utilised and really thought through to bring everybody together, you know, quite central as well. And if you've got people right on the doorstep, that can be sort of, you know, really thought through.
Nice. Okay, we're going to sort of wrap it up, but I mean, I just thought, the questions there, and actually this has been a really useful conversation to start that sort of debrief, and I don't need to sort of surmise it all now, but I think sort of ending on this idea of the kind of like the intimate or the small scale, or the kind of, that being a key characteristic of kind of what you picked up, and it's nice. I would like to take the opportunity to say thanks to Kristina and Callum, Paul for In-Situ for supporting just the overall programme and kind of building bridges for hosting us and being part of it as well. I think the opportunity to kind of come in and work in a place like Nelson is because of all the hard work that you've been doing and kind of continue to do on a day-to-day basis. So thanks to you as well. But thank you very much to Artists Available.
Can I just flip that back to all of you guys as well to thank you so much for your hard work, for working so well as a team. It's been great to sort of knowing that these artists, the group selection of artists have been working on the coalface, as it were, for the last few months, finding out so much information, meeting new people that are really going to help us and aid us with the programme ahead. Just to say very briefly, Andy, thanks ever so much for setting the premise and the thematics. And it's really interesting to work through this as a process in terms of research as an instigator for new ideas, but also some practical projects. And for us going forward in a programme perspective, which we have some milestones and things to hit, to know that the programming that we're beginning to pull together is based in knowledge, research, and sort of some testing out. So that gives us a real confidence in being able to go forward with some of that, and feel that we've had it's been trialled and discussed. It's not just us coming up with these ideas for the good of the town. It's actually been kind of tried out. So that gives us a huge amount of confidence. So thank you ever so much. I've really, really enjoyed this weekend. I hope everyone else has as well. Just seeing all the work consolidated and in quite an intense type of way, it's actually been brilliant to sort of knit together some of these ideas. The exhibition's great, and it will be up for probably about a month, because then after that the space is getting a bit of a refurb. So thank you again. Thank you.